My wife took my surgery cash for her sister's dream wedding while I needed fast surgery. So I filed for divorce from the hospital bed and sued her sister for stealing. I never imagined my wife would choose a wedding over my life. But the day I learned I might lose a kidney, I discovered our entire emergency fund had vanished, swallowed by a secret family debt. I was still reeling from the doctor's words, the image of that jagged white mass on the scan, an 8mm stone digging into my kidney like a shard of glass. He'd shown me on the screen, pointing to the blockage, explaining how my kidney function was already dropping. Surgery, he said, had to happen within days, or I faced permanent damage. It was urgent. And the cost? A gut-punching $12,000 out of pocket thanks to our ridiculous insurance deductible. But honestly, I wasn't scared about the money. Not then. Olivia and we'd been married 6 years, always on the same page, splitting everything 50-50, building that emergency fund precisely for moments like this. We'd sacrificed so much, vacations, fancy dinners, to squirrel away nearly $18,000. Driving home that afternoon, a strange gratitude washed over me, thinking, this is it. This is exactly what we saved for. I walked into our apartment and found Olivia at the kitchen table, her laptop open, surrounded by what looked like wedding magazines. Chloe's wedding was just 10 days away, and I remember thinking it was sweet that Olivia was still helping her plan. I sat down across from her and, as calmly as I could, explained everything the doctor had said. I watched her face as I described the stone, the urgent surgery, the dropping kidney function. She nodded, seemed concerned, even asked the right questions about recovery time and pain. A wave of relief washed over me. I had a partner who would face this with me. Then I said the one thing that changed everything. So, we'll need to pull $12,000 from the emergency fund. But that's exactly what we saved it for, right? I expected her to agree immediately, maybe squeeze my hand and tell me it would all be okay. Instead, her expression shifted. It was a mixture of panic and guilt I'd never seen before, and my stomach dropped before she even opened her mouth. She started talking fast, a torrent of words explaining how Chloe was having financial issues with the wedding. The venue increased its price. The catering company needed a bigger deposit. Noah's family had backed out of contributing their share. Olivia said Chloe had come to her crying 3 weeks ago, desperate and heartbroken, facing the possibility of canceling her dream wedding after invitations were sent and the dress was bought. My wife told me she'd made a decision in that moment to help her baby sister, that family was supposed to support each other, and she'd transferred $14,000 to Chloe's account as a loan, to be paid back within 6 months. I just sat there, processing. Olivia kept talking, her voice getting defensive as she insisted it wasn't a gift, but a temporary loan, that Chloe and Noah had both signed a promissory note. She'd been planning to tell me, she said, but the timing never felt right. I finally asked her, point blank, why she would make a $14,000 decision without consulting me, when it was our shared money, our shared safety net. She said she knew I'd overthink it and try to talk her out of it. The argument that followed lasted 3 hours and covered every room in our apartment. I tried to explain that this wasn't about Chloe or the wedding, but about making unilateral financial decisions that affected both of us. It was about taking money specifically designated for emergencies, like the one I was currently facing. Olivia just kept circling back to the same points. Chloe would pay us back with interest. The wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event. My surgery, she insisted, could wait 1 more week until she could pull some money from other sources. Then she looked at me and said, "It's not like you're dying. It's just a kidney stone. People deal with those all the time." I told her the doctor had specifically said delay was dangerous, that I was already running a low-grade fever, which could indicate early infection, that kidney damage was permanent. She rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic, that everyone exaggerates medical issues, that her uncle had a kidney stone once and just drank a bunch of lemon water. I pulled up the medical papers on my phone and showed her where the urologist had written in capital letters that surgical intervention was urgent, where he'd highlighted the phrases kidney function decline and risk of sepsis. Olivia barely looked at them before saying Chloe's wedding was in 10 days and asking me to postpone surgery by 1 week wouldn't kill me. You can wait, she said. It's her special day. The way she said it, with such finality, like my health was somehow negotiable against her sister's party, made something crack inside me. I moved to the guest bedroom that night. I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her. Over the next 2 days, my condition got worse. I was stuck in this nightmare situation, needing surgery I couldn't afford because my wife had stolen our emergency fund. Yes, I started thinking of it as theft. Even though, legally, it probably wasn't since we had a joint account. The pain intensified from a dull ache to these sharp, stabbing sensations that took my breath away. I started running a fever, tracking it obsessively on our bathroom thermometer. Olivia noticed I was declining but kept minimizing it, bringing me Tylenol and saying I'd feel better soon. She'd mention every few hours that Chloe's rehearsal dinner was coming up and she needed to focus on helping with final preparations. On the third morning after my diagnosis, I woke up feeling like I was burning from the inside out. I stumbled to the bathroom and saw that my urine looked pink and cloudy. I took my temperature and watched the digital numbers climb to 103.2 degrees. I knew what this meant because the doctor had explained it: fever plus urinary symptoms plus a blocked kidney equaled infection. That infection in a blocked urinary system could progress to sepsis within hours. That sepsis could kill you faster than most people realized. I texted my brother Mark to let him know what was happening. Then I called an Uber to the emergency room because Olivia had already left for the day to help Chloe with dress alterations, and I didn't want to wait for her to come back. The ER doctor took one look at my chart and the results from my rapid tests and immediately started 4 antibiotics, explaining that I was in early-stage sepsis and needed emergency surgery right now. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours, but as soon as they could get an operating room ready. They admitted me directly to the ICU. I remember lying there with multiple intravenous lines running into my arms, watching the monitors beep and flash while nurses rushed around, adjusting equipment. I texted Olivia to let her know what was happening, and she responded 3 hours later saying she'd come by after the rehearsal dinner, that Chloe really needed her support right now, that I was in good hands with the doctors. I didn't respond because I was being prepped for surgery, and also because I'd just realized something that should have been obvious days ago. My wife had chosen her sister's wedding over my life. She had let me deteriorate to the point of organ failure because she didn't want to admit she'd made a catastrophic financial decision. She had prioritized flower arrangements and seating charts over my kidney function. They wheeled me toward the operating room around 8 p.m. I remember thinking that Olivia was probably at some nice restaurant right then, toasting Chloe and Noah while I went under anesthesia, not knowing if my kidney could be saved or if the infection had already spread too far. The last thing I heard before the anesthesia kicked in was a nurse saying my wife had called to check on me. I felt nothing about that information, just this cold, empty space where my feelings for Olivia used to be. While she was getting ready for her sister's rehearsal dinner, picking out her outfit, and curling her hair, I was in the ICU fighting an infection that could have been prevented if she'd just been honest about the money 3 weeks earlier. I woke up 3 days after the surgery with tubes coming out of places I didn't know could have tubes and a pain in my side that felt like someone had taken a baseball bat to my ribs. The nurse explained that the operation had taken longer than expected because the infection had spread further than the initial scan showed. They'd managed to save my kidney, but the damage was significant. I'd been unconscious for most of the past 72 hours while my body fought off the sepsis. She said I was lucky to be alive. That phrase kept echoing in my head because I'd been hours away from complete organ failure when they'd gotten me into the operating room. When I finally managed to focus my eyes, I saw my brother Mark slumped in the chair next to my bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He told me he'd driven 6 hours that first night after getting my text from the ER, and he'd been camping out at the hospital ever since. Mark said Olivia had shown up once on the second day while I was still unconscious. She'd stayed for maybe 20 minutes and spent most of that time on her phone texting about wedding details. He wanted to throw her out of the room but didn't want to cause a scene in the ICU. She'd left some gas station flowers on the side table, those cheap wrapped bouquets they sell next to the lottery tickets, and promised to come back soon. the hospital billing department came by that afternoon and explained that my total costs were running around $18,000 because the emergency surgery and ICU stay weren't covered the same way as scheduled procedures would have been. I had insurance, but the combination of out-of-network emergency doctors and the extended intensive care meant my out-of-pocket maximum was getting demolished. I'd be paying this off for years. I kept thinking about how we'd had $18,000 in savings 3 weeks ago. How that money could have covered the original planned surgery with room to spare. How instead I was lying here with permanent kidney damage and a massive medical bill because my wife had decided her sister's party was more important. Olivia finally showed up later that same day wearing a sundress that I recognized as new, probably bought for one of the wedding events. She had this bright, fake smile that dissolved the second she saw my face. She tried to act concerned, asking about my pain levels and whether the food was okay. But there was this distracted quality to everything she said, like she was running through a script. Then she hit me with the line that made me realize our marriage was completely over. "I'm so glad you're doing better, but did you really need to have the surgery right then? I mean, the wedding is in 3 days and I've barely been able to help Chloe." She said it like I'd deliberately chosen the most inconvenient time to nearly die, like my sepsis was a scheduling conflict. We could have worked around it with better planning. I asked her if she understood that I'd nearly died, that sepsis claims lives, that the doctors had told me another 6 hours and I might not have made it. Olivia waved her hand dismissively and said that doctors always exaggerate to cover themselves legally. That obviously I'd been fine since I was sitting here talking to her. She actually used the word inconvenient to describe my emergency surgery. Said the timing had been really inconvenient for everyone. That was the moment I stopped seeing her as my wife and started seeing her as a stranger who happened to share my last name. Someone whose priorities were so fundamentally different from mine that we might as well have been from different planets. After she left, I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles and thinking about all the small moments over the past 6 years that I'd ignored or explained away, times when Olivia had chosen her family over our marriage. When she'd made decisions without consulting me, when she'd dismissed my concerns as overdramatic. I'd always told myself that she was just close with her family, that her loyalty was admirable. But now I could see it for what it really was, this toxic codependency where her sister's wants would always trump my actual needs. I called my lawyer that evening from the hospital bed using the phone they'd given me to order meals. Mr. Harrison and I had worked together years ago on some contract reviews for my job, and I'd always remembered him as straightforward and practical. The kind of attorney who didn't waste time on emotions. I explained the situation in clinical terms, the emergency fund withdrawal without consent, the delayed surgery, the sepsis, the wedding that was apparently more important than my life. He listened without interrupting and then said something that crystallized everything. "What you're describing is financial infidelity, and courts take it very seriously, especially when one spouse's decisions directly harm the other." He explained that I had grounds for divorce based on the financial betrayal alone, but that the medical consequences made it even more clear-cut. Then he suggested something I hadn't even considered, that I could pursue a civil claim against Chloe for conversion of funds, essentially arguing that she'd accepted money she knew wasn't freely given. The idea felt nuclear, but also perfectly appropriate, and I found myself agreeing to both actions before I'd fully thought through the implications. Mr. Harrison said he'd draft the divorce papers immediately, and that we could do everything digitally since I was stuck in the hospital, that he'd include the medical bills and emergency fund documentation as evidence of financial harm. He also said he'd prepare a separate lawsuit against Chloe for the $14,000 plus interest and legal fees, arguing she'd had reason to know the money wasn't given with full marital consent. I signed the divorce papers on an iPad 2 days later while I was still connected to an intravenous drip and heart monitor, using my finger to scroll a digital signature that felt surreal and final. Mr. Harrison had arranged for Olivia to be served that same day, and he'd also sent copies to the wedding venue with a legal notice about the disputed funds. I knew this would blow up the wedding, but I'd stopped caring about that somewhere around the time I'd been fighting for my life while my wife picked out her outfit for a rehearsal dinner. The venue called Chloe within an hour of receiving the notice and told her they were putting everything on hold until the legal dispute was resolved, that they couldn't proceed with an event that was potentially funded by stolen money. Chloe called Olivia. Olivia called me, and my phone started ringing while I was working on the breathing exercises my physical therapist had shown me. I let it go to voicemail 3 times before finally answering. Olivia's voice came through screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She called me every name she could think of, said I was destroying her family, that I was being vindictive and cruel, that she'd never forgive me for ruining her sister's special day. I waited until she ran out of steam and the screaming turned to crying. Those big, dramatic sobs that she'd always been able to turn on when she wanted sympathy. Then I said the only thing that mattered. You asked me to wait for my surgery so your sister could have her wedding. You let me get to the point where I almost died, and now you're upset that I'm not waiting to file for divorce? The line went quiet except for her breathing. And then she tried a different approach, her voice going soft and pleading, begging me to hold off just 1 more week so Chloe could have her day and then we could deal with our problems. I told her the wedding was cancelled and hung up while she was mid-sentence. The nurses told me later that afternoon that my vitals had improved significantly after that phone call, that my blood pressure had dropped to normal levels for the first time since I'd been admitted. I realized that ending my marriage was apparently better for my health than staying in it had ever been. The wedding got officially cancelled that evening, and I heard through Mark that Chloe's fiancé, Noah, had called everything off, not just the ceremony, but the entire relationship. This happened after finding out that his bride-to-be had accepted $14,000 from her sister without questioning whether it was really okay. Apparently, Noah had asked Chloe point-blank if she'd known the money came from our emergency fund without my permission. And when she'd hesitated before answering, he'd realized she'd had doubts but had taken it anyway. He told her that anyone willing to take money from a sick person for a party wasn't someone he wanted to build a life with, and he'd walked out of their apartment that same night. Olivia called me 6 more times over the next 2 days, and I ignored every single call, finally blocking her number when she started leaving voicemails that alternated between rage and desperate pleading. Her mother, Brenda, tried calling, too, leaving me a message about how I was tearing the family apart. And how could I be so heartless toward Chloe, who'd done nothing wrong? I deleted it without listening to the whole thing, because I was done explaining myself to people who thought a wedding was more important than someone's life. The hospital discharged me after 8 days with a list of restrictions longer than my arm, instructions for wound care, 3 different medications, and a follow-up appointment to assess the permanent damage to my kidney function. Mark drove me home to the apartment I'd shared with Olivia. We found that she'd cleared out about half her stuff, but had left everything in chaos. Drawers hanging open and closet doors ajar, like she'd packed in a rage. There was a note on the kitchen counter saying she was staying with Chloe and that I destroyed both their lives over money that would have been paid back anyway. I read it once and then threw it in the trash because the delusion required to write something like that was beyond anything I wanted to engage with. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in over a week. Despite the pain in my side and the emotional devastation of my imploded marriage, I felt more at peace than I had in months. The wedding was cancelled and my marriage was over. But that was just the beginning of how everything fell apart. The divorce hearing happened exactly 11 weeks after I filed the papers, which felt both impossibly long and shockingly fast, depending on which moment I was living in. I'd spent those weeks recovering physically while watching my marriage disintegrate legally, going to physical therapy 3 times a week and meeting with Mr. Harrison twice a week to prepare for court. My kidney function tests came back showing I'd lost about 40% capacity on the damaged side, which the kidney specialist explained was permanent and would affect me for the rest of my life. I'd need regular monitoring, dietary restrictions, and I'd have to be careful with medications and alcohol. All because Olivia had prioritized a party over my health. The lawsuit against Chloe was scheduled for the week after the divorce hearing, and Mr. Harrison had explained that we were pursuing it separately to avoid complicating the divorce proceedings, that keeping them distinct would actually strengthen both cases. Olivia had hired a lawyer who was apparently coaching her to play the victim. And I'd heard through Mark that she was planning to paint me as controlling and vindictive, someone who'd weaponized the legal system to punish her family. The morning of the divorce hearing, I put on the only suit that still fit after losing 15 pounds in the hospital. I met Mr. Harrison outside the courthouse where he reviewed our strategy one final time. He said the judge had already reviewed all our documentation, including the medical records, the emergency fund statements, and the timeline of events, and that our case was solid. The hearing itself felt surreal in how mundane it was, just a series of questions and answers in a bland courtroom that smelled like old wood and disappointment. Olivia sat on the opposite side with her attorney, wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup, clearly styled to look sympathetic and wronged. Her lawyer tried to argue that the emergency fund was marital property that she had equal right to access, that loans between family members were normal, and that my medical emergency had been unpredictable and therefore Olivia couldn't have known I'd need the money. Mr. Harrison calmly dismantled each argument by walking through the timeline, pointing out that Olivia had taken the money 3 weeks before my diagnosis, that she'd hidden the withdrawal, and most importantly, that she'd refused to return it even after learning I needed emergency surgery. He presented the text messages where I'd explained the medical urgency, and Olivia had responded that I was being dramatic, the voicemails where she'd said the wedding was more important, and the hospital records showing I'd nearly died from a preventable complication. The judge was a woman in her 60s who'd spent the entire hearing taking notes with an expression that gave nothing away. But when she finally spoke, her tone was ice cold. She said that while marital assets were normally divided equally, this case involved financial decisions that had directly endangered my health and life, that Olivia's actions constituted a breach of fiduciary duty to the marriage. The ruling came down harder than I'd expected, with Olivia responsible for 60% of my medical bills, which came to about $11,000 in installments, no spousal support despite her request for it, and an immediate repayment of $7,000 from her share of our remaining marital assets. Her lawyer tried to argue that the penalties were excessive, but the judge cut her off and said that someone who chose a party over their spouse's life-saving surgery shouldn't expect the court's sympathy. Olivia's face went white when she heard the ruling, and I watched her whisper something angry to her lawyer, but I felt nothing except the tired sense of relief that it was finally over. The lawsuit against Chloe the following week was shorter, but somehow more bitter, because Chloe actually showed up to defend herself, sitting in the courtroom with her mother, Brenda, who kept glaring at me like I'd personally destroyed their family. Chloe's attorney argued that she'd received the money as a gift, that she'd had no knowledge of my medical situation, and that family loans didn't require the same formal consent as business transactions. Mr. Harrison presented the timeline showing that Chloe's wedding planning had accelerated right around when Olivia withdrew the money. Text messages between the sisters discussing how I'd probably be upset, but would get over it. And most damaging, a voicemail Chloe had left Olivia 2 days before my surgery, asking if I'd really agreed to the loan because Noah was getting suspicious. That voicemail destroyed Chloe's entire defense because it proved she'd known there was a problem with the money's origin but had chosen to keep it anyway. The judge ruled that Chloe had to repay the full $14,000 plus 18 months of interest, and that since she couldn't pay it as a lump sum, her wages would be garnished at $400 per month until the debt was satisfied. Chloe started crying when she heard the payment plan, and her mother actually stood up and shouted that I was ruining a young woman's life over money, that I should be ashamed of myself for being so petty. The bailiff had to escort them out, and I sat there feeling simultaneously vindicated and exhausted by the whole spectacle. In the weeks after both court cases, I learned through various sources how thoroughly everything had collapsed for Olivia and Chloe. The wedding had obviously never been rescheduled, and Noah had gotten engaged to someone else within 10 months. Apparently, someone he'd known from work, who he'd gotten close to after the breakup. Chloe had to take on 2 jobs to cover the garnishment payments and her share of the apartment she now shared with Olivia, since neither of them could afford to live alone after Chloe lost her event planning position when word got around about the lawsuit. Olivia was working at a call center and sleeping on an air mattress in the living room of their 1-bedroom apartment, paying off her portion of my medical bills in installments that would take her roughly 4.5 years to complete. Her mother, Brenda, had stopped trying to contact me entirely and was telling everyone who'd listen that I destroyed her daughters over a medical issue that wasn't even that serious, conveniently forgetting the sepsis and organ damage. Mark told me that Olivia had tried to reach out to some of our mutual friends to get them on her side, but most people had heard the full story by then and weren't interested in maintaining friendships with someone who'd let their spouse nearly die for a wedding. I adopted a cat about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, an orange tabby from the shelter, who I named Kidney. It was a dark joke that made my therapist shake her head. The cat didn't care about my medical history or my failed marriage. He just wanted food and lap time. And there was something deeply healing about having a living thing in my apartment who needed me without any complicated emotional baggage. I was still dealing with the physical aftermath of everything. The reduced kidney function meant I got tired more easily and had to watch my protein intake, and I had regular appointments to monitor for any further deterioration. The kidney specialist said I'd probably be fine for decades if I took care of myself, but that I needed to be careful and that any future kidney problems would be more serious because I was already starting from a compromised position. The financial recovery took longer than the physical or emotional. Between the medical bills and legal fees, I'd spent close to $30,000 total. And even with Olivia's court-ordered payments, I was still paying off credit cards and payment plans. But I managed to put a down payment on a small house with my share of the divorce settlement. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Every time I made a mortgage payment, I felt grateful that I'd gotten out before Olivia could make any more unilateral decisions with our money. Sometimes late at night, I'd think about the moment in the hospital when I realized my marriage was over. Lying there with intravenous lines and surgical drains while my wife complained about wedding logistics, and I'd feel this strange mixture of grief and relief. I'd lost my marriage, my health, and a significant chunk of my savings. But I'd gained something more valuable, which was the absolute certainty that I'd never again let someone make me feel like my life was negotiable. People asked me sometimes if I regretted filing for divorce from a hospital bed, if I thought I'd been too harsh or moved too fast. And my answer was always the same. When someone asks you to postpone life-saving surgery for their sister's party, you don't wait to file for divorce. You just save yourself the time. What do you think? Was I wrong to push back so hard?